I'd like to show you another game by Bobby Fischer from the Blitz tournament held in Herceg Novi in Yugoslavia in 1970. Fischer absolutely dominated this event, winning with 19 out of 22, 4.5 points ahead of Mikhail Tal, not a bad Blitz player. And what a stellar lineup there was in this tournament. Apart from Tal, there was Petrosian, Korchnoi, Bronstein, Smyslov, Reshevsky, and so on. But Fischer, he was just unstoppable. And this was really the start of a golden period for him, culminating, of course, in his World Championship match against Boris Spassky in 1972. Let's have a look at the game I want to show you today. It's against Borislav Ivkov. Now, Ivkov was one of the strongest players in Yugoslavia in the immediate post-war generation in the 1950s and 1960s. Gligoric was probably just ahead of him, but Ivkov was right up there. So a very decent player. And he's playing, well, a kind of modern and modern Piets. Very often Fischer liked to play with f4, but here in a Blitz game he's playing much more pragmatically and just accepting a small centre but solidly maintained, and c3, a pragmatic move, basically just bolstering d4, making sure that that bishop isn't doing anything tricky on the diagonal. And this system is very respectable indeed for white. And this is a really common position. Black, of course, is aiming to hit out with e5. Most popular move here is rook e1, very sensible. There's also knight d2. But Fischer goes for queen e2. I have to say, personally, I'm not too keen on that move. But anyway, let's see how things work out. e5. The problem with the queen on e2 is that Black would like at some moment to open the position and put the rook on e8 opposite the queen, and that's a bit uncomfortable. In fact, seems to me a sensible idea to trade pawns here, and white is still very slightly better, although the pawn structure is almost symmetrical. White's pieces are a little bit better because you can see that bishop somehow isn't so well placed on g7. But Fischer plays h3. Obviously, that's to prevent a bishop coming out to g4. Knight h5. And we can see another reason why the queen can sometimes be a little bit vulnerable on e2 if a knight manages to land on f4. Of course, that's not going to happen at the moment. That would just be exchanged off. But there's a threat to take on d4 now. So Fischer plays bishop g5. That's a disruptive move. Fischer wants Black to play f6, which of course would blunt the bishop on g7. But bishop f6 instead. Now, of course, you don't want to trade here because then Black just has a beautiful position with the queen on f6 as well, supporting the knight. Lovely attack for Black. But here's the idea. Fischer now drops the bishop back, protecting the pawn here, and the bishop on f6 is a bit awkwardly placed. So Ivkov just puts it straight back on g7. And knight d2 from Fischer. So everything all right so far. Now rook e8. Now we can see the problem with the queen on e2. That if Black manages to open things up, then the rook opposite the queen is a bit awkward. You know, Black can even start to consider moves like d5 here. Therefore, Fischer closed the position with d5. So now the game takes on more of a character of a King's Indian. But this is favourable for Black. After this move, knight f4. Now, of course, this has to be taken because of the threat here. And obviously the threat to the queen. White doesn't really want to give up that dark squared bishop because this bishop on g7 now has no opponent and just rakes across the board, hitting b2, which of course was defended by the rook. And this should be a very pleasant position for black. The most obvious way to play is pawn to h6 followed by g5, and that puts the knight on an excellent square on g6, and one could even later on consider advancing with g4 to break open white's king position. But Ivkov plays another way, which is also not bad. That knight on e7 is the problem, but it suddenly finds a decent square. It might come to d4, it might come to h4. But also it opens up the e-file for the rook. And of course, black is exploiting the pin here on the e-file. And Fischer lashes out. It's essential that white finds counterplay here. Remember, it's a blitz game. You just want a nice, clear plan. And Fischer finds one. He just wants to make a breakthrough on the queen side. Just a reminder that in this tournament, it was said that Fischer didn't use more than 2.5 minutes on any game that he played. Remember, it's blitz tournament, 5 minutes for all the moves. Now that's extraordinary. So he was playing incredibly quickly, putting pressure on his opponents. The problem with b4 is that it gets met by b5. Excellent move. Now, of course, white doesn't want to push on like this, because then it's going to be really difficult to advance c5. We could just close this, and then it'll be black's turn on the king side. So that's dreadful. But if you play a3, then of course black trades, and the rook can always come down to a2, maybe a3, and white can't challenge that because of this fantastic bishop covering the a1 square. a3 is really the move I would like to play to maintain the nice pawns here. So Fischer took on a5. That's a bit unfortunate, having to break up those pawns. But at least after this, he gains a bit of time, hitting the rook, and then at least getting in c5, which frees the bishop here. So he's starting to open up the queen side, and that will give him some counterplay. Here, Ivkov played h6, but taking on c5 looks like a good idea, because after this, the knight is going to have to come back. And it's really not very well placed at all. And then knight h4. And I think black's pieces stand very well. In fact, all black's pieces, even though these are on the back rank, they're very actively placed. Because this bishop is looking at h3. If white were to trade, and that brings the queen to a superb square on h4, and both rooks are very nicely placed on these open files or semi-open files. That looks like a good way for black to play, but instead Ivkov played h6, which allows bishop b5. And, well, maybe, yeah, this is a bit unfortunate for black. You don't really want to play rook e7 here, which blocks the queen. In fact, I guess we could probably play something like queen d3, and that traps the knight, as the knight can no longer go here. So bishop d7 played, and now Fischer missed a good opportunity. If he'd traded and played queen d3, then you can see the knight can't go here, so it would have to go back to e7. And you can see it's very poorly placed on e7. Really needs to get to g6 quickly, but in this case, white is going to find counterplay on the queen side. But instead, Fischer played a4, which in the blitz game, a totally understandable move. That a pawn is vulnerable. It was defended by the queen, but even so, somehow it looks like the position has improved for white after this. As I said, Fischer would be playing extremely quickly, putting all the pressure on his opponent. So Ivkov exchanged. It feels as though Fischer's position has certainly improved with that pawn on b5, so squashing black's queenside, and it introduces, well, all kinds of possibilities. Perhaps even b6 and c6 to create a far advanced passed pawn. Knight h4, but black is still doing fine because his pieces are so actively placed. The rook's on the open files in particular. Nevertheless, at least Fischer has found a clear plan, and I think in blitz that's the most important thing. You find a plan that you can carry through quickly without thinking too long. So at least he's managed to open up the queenside and now shuffles the knight round to c4, where it can attack the pawn on d6 and looks at some very important squares as well. Nevertheless, black is also doing pretty well. Good move, bishop d4. And this looks a bit serious. So knight c4, both players, you could say, have carried out their plans. So black is attacking the pawn on f2, although Fischer has it defended for the moment. But Fischer has managed to activate this knight, break through on the queen side to some extent, and is attacking the pawn on d6. So I think this is the peak of the battle, actually. But here's where Ivkov goes wrong. This is a very hard move to play in blitz. Rook c8 is the best move. He didn't play this with the idea that if white were to take this pawn on d6, then after black's rook's double on the 7th, f2 is going to cave in, and this is winning for black. Now, white can hold that knight on c4 with rook c1. But then, well, if black just waits here and plays, for example, king g7, it's actually very hard for white to make a decent move here. You still can't take on d6 because, well, after the exchange, then f2 caves in. Very difficult position. But instead, after knight c4, attacking the pawn on d6, Ivkov played a very natural move, queen f6, defending the pawn, keeping in touch with the bishop as well. Everything seemed absolutely fine for black, but here is where Fischer took over the initiative. First of all, rook d1. Looking at the bishop, so understandably Ivkov dropped it to c5, and now e5. Moves like this, where you're going forward, taking the initiative, incredibly difficult to defend against in blitz. Objectively, black is still fine here. He should play queen e6 here to keep tabs on the d pawn and also look at the knight on c4. But instead, e4 by Ivkov, a very natural move in a sense, but no doubt he'd underestimated d7. That pawn piles forward, so that pawn gets taken, and now you can see that the situation has, in the space of a couple of moves, has completely shifted. It's still even material, but Ivkov has to deal with that pawn on d7. So he tries some distraction, f3. Now, blitz chess, you want to play practically. So what do? Do you take this, allow your king to be opened when these pieces are still looking at f2 and maybe the queen is lurking around the king? Of course not. Objectively, that's actually the best move. But no, you play practically. Fischer just took this and exchanged queens. So he knows he's better. And here, actually, black is still okay after f6. Bringing the king potentially towards that d pawn. And it's actually very difficult for white to make progress there. But if you're short of time, keeping a cool head in such situations when there's a pawn on d7 is very, very difficult. Ivkov played rook c2, he cracked, and the knight came into a5, attacking the pawn on b7, and now black is utterly lost, and the game ended like this. Takes, and rook e1. If you wanted a picture of central domination, then that is it. Here, the game is over, black resigned. Obviously rook e8 check coming next. Well, just look at this position. Compare this with 10 moves earlier, this position, where it looks as though black's position is absolutely fine. Just 10 moves later, it came to this. Ivkov must have looked at this and looked at his opponent and thought, what am I playing against? There we go. Fischer just in superb form in this tournament. If you want to see some more games by Fischer from the Herceg Novi Blitz tournament, then do check out the playlist above. And, well, you'll see lots of other games by Fischer as well. Just click the info tab and also click on the video description where you'll see playlists from lots of other players that I've featured on this channel. Thanks for watching.